The story of Jack and the Beanstalk. Once upon a time, there was a very poor woman who lived with her young son Jack in a small cottage deep in the countryside. They had no money at all, and were it not for a few vegetables they grew and the cow they possessed, they would surely have starved. One day, however, the cow's milk started to dry up, and Jack and his mother knew that very soon they would have neither milk to drink nor milk with which to make butter and cheese. With much sadness, they decided the cow would have to be sold and the money used to buy food and seed for more vegetables. One morning, therefore, Jack set out for market, leading the cow on the end of a rope. Jack usually enjoyed the market with all the people, animals, colour and noise, but on this occasion he walked slowly because he did not want to part with his old friend. He'd been travelling for about an hour when he passed an old man sitting on a gate beside the road. "Are you going to market to sell your cow?" asked the old man. "Why, yes," said Jack. "I would like to buy your cow," said the old man, "but I can't pay you in money. But beans, magic beans." "Magic beans?" gasped Jack. "I've never heard of such things." The old man laughed and went on, "No, I don't suppose you have. But here they are, and I tell you they will bring you greater fortune than all the money in the marketplace." The old man placed the 5 beans in Jack's hand and, taking the rope, walked slowly away leading the cow. Jack looked down at the beans in his hand, and something told him that the old man was honest and had told him the truth. "Magic beans," he thought. "This is really exciting. I must run home and tell Mother." And this is just what he did. But his mother was very angry indeed that he had exchanged their precious cow for 5 miserable beans, and she threw them out of the window, snorting at the idea that the beans might be magic. Jack had no supper and went to bed hungry and miserable, wondering where their poor cow was sleeping that night. He woke early, soon after dawn, and went out into the garden to find something to eat. He was astonished to find the beans had grown a huge stalk with great green leaves, stretching so high into the sky that the top disappeared into the clouds. He remembered the old man's words and immediately started clambering up the beanstalk. It was easy to climb because there were so many branches to hang on to, and very soon he was surrounded by cloud. Then he found himself on top of a great cloud bank and saw a track leading away from the sun, and at the end of it there stood a huge castle with great towers and turrets. Having had no supper the previous night, and after his long climb, Jack was very hungry indeed. He ran towards the castle, and when he reached the great doors he had great difficulty in reaching the rope to pull the bell. He heard heavy footsteps, and the door creaked open. Before him stood the biggest woman he had ever seen in his life, and he was very afraid. The woman looked down at Jack and asked him what he wanted. I was wondering, ma'am, if I could do some work for you in exchange for some food," replied Jack as boldly as his voice would allow. The woman grunted and beckoned Jack to follow, leaving the great doors open behind him. Jack found himself in a huge kitchen with huge furniture. His head didn't even reach the seat of the chairs. "You'd better have some food first. You look skinny. You'll work better with something in your stomach," said the woman, filling a bowl with thick meat soup, placing it on a stool so that Jack could just reach it. He had only taken one mouthful when suddenly the room began to shake, and there was a sound rather like an approaching thunderstorm. Then Jack heard a great, deep, bellowing voice. "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman.
Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread."
The woman whispered to Jack, "Quick, into the cupboard." And Jack just had time to squeeze behind the cupboard door when into the room came a huge giant, even bigger than the woman. Through the crack of the door, Jack watched the giant looking round the kitchen, and then the woman, who was the giant's wife, told the giant to sit down at the table, and that what he could smell was the roast ox which he had prepared for his breakfast. Jack could hardly believe his eyes as the giant picked up the ox in his hands and tore into it with his great teeth, grunting and gasping as he chewed and swallowed. Presently he called to his wife,
"Woman, bring me my golden hen."
And she obeyed at once, bringing him a beautiful hen, which sat on the giant's lap and immediately laid him a large golden egg. Jack stared in wonderment, and then noticed that the giant was falling asleep. He started snoring, and the hen jumped from his lap onto the floor. Seeing that the woman was busy washing up, Jack crept from his hiding place, picked the hen up and tiptoed out of the kitchen. As fast as he could, he ran from the castle and along the road until he reached the top of the beanstalk. He swung himself onto it and started clambering down. He was very glad indeed to get at the bottom, and he ran quickly into the house, where he found his mother sitting in her chair crying because she thought Jack had run away. She was very relieved to see him, and he placed the golden hen on the floor. No sooner had he done so than it laid a fine golden egg. Jack's mother was overjoyed and hugged and kissed him, for she knew they would never be poor again. She gathered some vegetables and made some soup, and over supper Jack told his mother of his adventures. Then, full and contented, Jack went to bed and slept soundly. He was awake at dawn and crept out of bed, determined to climb the beanstalk again to see what else he could bring back to his mother. She was still fast asleep, and so did not see him climb the beanstalk and disappear once again into the clouds. Jack ran to the castle, but this time did not try and pull the bell. He found a small cellar window open, and climbing in, made his way to the kitchen. He could see the giant's wife roasting a big pig on a spit over the fire, and very quietly he crept into the cupboard and hid behind the door. No sooner was he there than the room began to shake, and the giant's huge footsteps could be heard approaching. The giant's wife threw up her hands in despair and muttered, "What can be the matter with him now?" No sooner had she said this than the giant roared, "Fee, fi, fo, fum! I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread." Jack trembled as the giant entered the room and stood looking round and snorting. His wife said, "Sit down and have your breakfast. It's pork you can smell, not Englishman." The giant grunted again and sat down, and then ate the pig as noisily and messily as he'd eaten the ox the day before. When he'd finished a flagon of wine, he roared to his wife, "Woman, bring me my bags of gold." The giant's wife left the room, and then, to Jack's astonishment, returned carrying several bags of gold, which she placed on the table in front of the giant. The giant laughed, gloated, and counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But as he did so, he became sleepier and sleepier until he fell forward on the table asleep, knocking one of the bags of gold onto the floor. As soon as the giant's wife had left the kitchen, Jack crept out of the cupboard and tiptoed to the bag of gold. It was very heavy indeed, and Jack could not lift it. He had to drag it across the kitchen floor. Luckily the giant was snoring so loudly that Jack could not be heard puffing and blowing. He heaved the bag out of the castle all the way along the road to the top of the beanstalk. He couldn't possibly climb down carrying so heavy a burden, so he tipped the bag through the clouds and then climbed down after it as quickly as he could. He was greatly relieved to find the bag safely on the ground near the base of the beanstalk. Indeed, the bag was so heavy that it had made quite a dent in the vegetable patch where it had landed. Again his mother was overjoyed to see him, and when Jack opened the bag and scooped out the gold coins, she hugged him again and nearly cried with joy. During the day, Jack ran into the market with one of the gold coins. He brought back their beloved cow, laden with food. That night, Jack and his mother had the best meal of their lives, and before they went to bed, very full and content, Jack had to promise his mother that he would never venture up the beanstalk again. The months went by, and summer followed the spring. As autumn approached, Jack noticed the large green leaves on the beanstalk turning brown, and he knew that soon they would fall off. One night he lay awake with a great longing to climb the beanstalk once again before winter set in. He was not usually a disobedient boy, and he knew very well that he and his mother had enough riches to last them all their lives. Nevertheless, he could not sleep with excitement at the thought of just one more adventure. At dawn, he slipped quietly out of the house and climbed up the beanstalk. Before he disappeared through the clouds, he gazed down at his home far below, and it looked like a toy house. He clambered through the clouds, and there before him at the end of the track stood the giant's great castle. He ran along the side of the hedge, and when he reached the castle, he went straight to the cellar window, which he had climbed through on his last visit. But it was fastened shut. Suddenly, a shadow fell across him, and looking round, he saw the giant's wife approaching the great doors. She put the basket down to get the key from her bag to open the door, and very quickly Jack scrambled into the basket. He found himself being carried into the castle, and still in the basket was set down upon the kitchen table. The giant's wife turned to look in the oven, and Jack hopped out of the basket onto the table and then down onto the floor. He hurried to his cupboard and peered at the woman, who was busy basting a whole lamb roasting in the oven. The smell was delicious, and Jack wished very much that he had had some breakfast. And then the steps of thunder were heard, and the room shook as the giant approached. The door crashed open, and with his hands on his hips, the giant sniffed the air and roared menacingly,
"Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread."
"Sit down," ordered his wife as she took the lamb from the oven. "If that's an Englishman, he's got 4 legs." The giant's eyes rolled in anticipation when he saw the dish before him, and he seized the animal in his hands and bit deeply into it. Jack watched him crunching even the bones in his great teeth, and saw him gulp down a great tankard of ale. His wife cleared the table as the giant said,
"I want music. Fetch me my magic harp."
The woman opened another cupboard door, and from it took a most beautiful magic harp, which he placed upon the floor. To Jack's amazement, it started playing a tune, a soft, sweet melody, and within a very few seconds the giant was asleep and snoring as loudly as before. Jack crept from his cupboard, placed both his hands upon the harp, and started dragging it towards the door. To his dismay, the music stopped, and the harp cried out, "Master! Master, help me! I am being stolen!" The giant grunted and started to awaken. Jack ran as fast as he could, pulling the harp behind him, as it called out again, "Help! Help!" By this time the giant was wide awake and saw Jack disappear through the door with his magic harp. With a great roar, he rose from his chair and gave chase. Jack was running down the track towards the beanstalk, but he could hear the great footsteps getting nearer and nearer. Luckily, the giant stumbled and fell. He'd eaten and drunk too much, and by the time he was on his feet again, Jack had reached the top of the beanstalk. He found the climb down very difficult with the harp in his hands, and even more difficult when the giant jumped onto the beanstalk, for it swayed from side to side under his great weight. With the giant getting closer and closer, Jack began to think he would never get to the ground safely, but as soon as he could see his house below, he called out, "Mother! Mother, fetch the axe from the shed! Hurry, or it will be too late!" Jack reached the foot of the beanstalk as the giant appeared through the clouds. He seized the axe from his mother and swung it at the stem of the beanstalk. After 3 strokes, he severed the stem, and the beanstalk started falling. With a terrible roar, The giant fell and crashed to the ground with such force that the whole earth shuddered like an earthquake. He made a great hole as he disappeared. And then there was silence. Jack's mother was so relieved to see him home safe and sound that she couldn't scold him, especially as the magic harp, knowing that it now had a new master, started playing sweet music. And so Jack, his mother, their cow, the golden hen, and the magic harp lived a happy, prosperous, and peaceful life for the rest of their days. It was a good thing the beanstalk had been cut down, for had it not been, Jack would surely have climbed it again for yet another adventure.
The Story of Dick Whittington. Many years ago in the county of Somerset, there lived a boy called Dick Whittington. His mother and father had died when he was little more than a baby. The villagers were very poor, but they did what they could to help and give him shelter and enough to eat. Dick used to sit and listen to them talk about London, where all the grand ladies and gentlemen lived, and where the streets were paved with gold. He made up his mind that one day he would journey to London and there make his fortune, though he had no idea how he'd reach the great city. One day, however, through the village there came a large wagon drawn by a team of horses on its way to London. Dick ran to the wagoner and explained how poor he was, but begged him to let him travel to London. The wagoner was a kind man, and feeling sorry for Dick, let him climb up beside him. And so Dick started on his road to fame and fortune. After many days they reached London, and the companions bade each other farewell. The wagoner gave Dick just 1 penny, for he knew that the boy had nothing. Dick wandered about, and soon realized that the streets, far from being paved with gold, were dusty and dirty. He spent his penny on food, and then, after a day and night without anything to eat, he fell down exhausted on the doorstep of a large house. When the cook opened the door, she was just about to kick him off the step when the master of the house, a Mr. Fitzwarren, who was a rich merchant, arrived home and asked the boy what he was doing. Dick was too weak to answer. Mr. Fitzwarren thought he was being insolent and ordered him to go away. Dick tried to get to his feet, but collapsed on the pavement. Mr. Fitzwarren then realized that the boy was ill, and much to the cook's annoyance, took him into the house and gave him food. When Dick told his story, Mr. Fitzwarren felt sorry for him, and as he needed extra help in the kitchen, he told Dick he could stay and work for him. Dick was very happy, although things were by no means easy. The other servants, especially the cook, were horrid to him, made him work very hard. But Mr. Fitzwarren had a daughter, Alice, who was very kind to him and gave him some better clothes. She also arranged for him to have a more comfortable bed in a room of his own in a garret. But then Dick found that rats and mice infested the attic at night and ran all over the floor and even the bed. Oh, he was so miserable that he decided to run away. But one day he earned an extra penny for cleaning the shoes of a visiting merchant. And soon afterwards he was sent out on an errand by the cook and happened to pass a woman carrying a cat. Thinking the cat might drive away the rats and mice, Dick asked the woman to sell him the cat for his penny. At first the woman refused, but when Dick told her why he wanted the cat, she sold it to him, telling him that it was a splendid mouser. Dick took the cat home, hiding her under his coat as he went into the house, and hurried to his room. From then on, he saved scraps from the kitchen and took them up to feed the cat, who worked so well at night that Dick was never plagued again with rats and mice. Now, Mr. Fitzwarren owned many ships, and whenever one set sail around the world to carry goods, selling and buying, he always called his servants together and asked them if they'd like to send some article on the ship for sale in a foreign country, so that they could earn some extra money. On this occasion, the ship was called the Unicorn, and all the servants assembled with their possessions. Alice noticed that Dick wasn't present and went to find him. He told her that as he possessed nothing to sell, there was no point in him being present. And when Alice offered to give him something, Mr. Fitzwarren forbade her, but knowing Dick had a cat, told him to fetch it and give it to the captain to sell in a foreign country. Dick had to obey his master, though he was very sad, for he was saying goodbye to his greatest friend. The good ship Unicorn set sail on the evening tide, and Dick returned to his garret, feeling very lonely and unhappy. After a few days, the cook scolded and beat Dick so much that once again he decided to run away. Early in the morning, he tied his few belongings into a bundle on the end of a stick and crept silently out of the house. In a few hours he reached Holloway and sat on a stone on the top of the hill to rest. As he sat there, he could hear Bow bells ringing, and as he listened, he thought he could hear them speaking to him. "Turn again, Whittington, thrice Lord Mayor of London." Dick thought this was a wonderful idea, so turned round and ran back to the house, and was able to get back into his room before anyone noticed he'd been away. While all this had been going on, the good ship Unicorn, with Dick's cat on board, had been sailing through storms and was sheltering off the Barbary coast where the Moors live. They seemed to be friendly, so the captain displayed all his wares on the deck of the ship and invited the Moors on board to see them. The Moors liked them so much that they went straight to their king's palace to tell him of what they'd seen. Immediately the king invited the captain to bring his cargo to the palace where he could inspect it. Now, in the country of the Moors, everyone sits on thick carpets on the floor, and the king had laid out a great feast for his visitors. Everyone sat down and were just about to eat when large numbers of rats and mice appeared and swarmed all over the food and ate most of it up. The captain was astonished and asked the king if he did not object to these animals. The king replied that he did not like them, but didn't know how to get rid of the rats and mice. The captain at once told the king of the wonderful cat which lived on his ship. The king asked the captain to fetch the cat, and within an hour or two, Dick's cat had killed every rat and every mouse in the palace. Oh, the king was so pleased that he offered the captain caskets of precious gems if he'd let the cat stay. The captain explained that if he let the cat go, his ship would be plagued again with rats and mice. But when the king said he'd fill the ship not only with jewels and gems, but also with gold, the captain couldn't refuse. Accordingly, after the Moors had filled the Unicorn with treasure, the captain and his crew said goodbye to Dick's cat and the Moors and set sail for England. As soon as the Unicorn had docked, the captain hurried to Mr. Fitzwarren and showed him the riches he brought back in exchange for Dick's cat. Mr. Fitzwarren summoned his servants, and when Dick came into the room, a chair was placed for him, and Dick was told to sit down. He thought he was being made fun of and begged Mr. Fitzwarren to let him go to his room, but his master, pointing to the treasure, said, "Mr. Whittington, your cat has brought you this great fortune, and you are now a richer man than I am." The captain then told the story of what had happened, and Dick could hardly believe what he heard. He told Mr. Fitzwarren he didn't want the treasure for himself, but would like to give it all to Mr. Fitzwarren and his family. But his master would not accept this kind offer, and so Dick gave presents to the captain and crew of the Unicorn and to Mr. Fitzwarren's staff, including the cook who had been so horrid to him. Dick Whittington was now a very rich man, and Mr. Fitzwarren asked if he'd like to become his partner as a merchant. Dick agreed at once, and hoped that one day he might cross the seas to the Barbary coast in one of their ships to see his friend the cat once again, and thank her for bringing him such good fortune. Dick and Alice fell in love, and Dick asked Mr. Fitzwarren if he could marry his daughter. Mr. Fitzwarren was delighted, and there was a grand wedding in the city of London, to which the Lord Mayor and his aldermen were invited. Dick became a very successful merchant and was much liked by the citizens of London. He was very kind to the poor and as a result he was made sheriff. Within a few years he was chosen as Lord Mayor of London and was knighted by the King at the palace, becoming Sir Richard Whittington. He was such a good Lord Mayor that twice more he was elected, and when the great Bow bells rang, Dick always remembered the stone on which he sat at Holloway when he heard them call out, "Turn again, Whittington, thrice Lord Mayor of London." Meanwhile, Dick's cat became the most important cat in the kingdom of the Moors. She had kittens who, when they grew up, were sent all over the country, so that there were no rats or mice left to pester the king and his subjects.
The story of the Hare and the Hedgehog. In the countryside, there are many different kinds of animals, all shapes and sizes. Some fly in the air, some run across the ground, and some burrow under the earth. But there could hardly be two more different-looking animals than the Hare and the Hedgehog, one soft-furred, long-eared, and a very, very fast runner, the other coated with large, sharp prickles, tiny ears, and so slow that he hardly looks as though he's moving at all. Now, one fine day, a big, bouncy hare met a hedgehog on the edge of a field.
"Oh, good morning, Mr. Slowcoach," said the hare to the hedgehog. "You're out for one of your slow walks, I see. I imagine you must have to start very early in the morning just to go down your garden path if you want to be back by nightfall."
And the hare roared with laughter. "Good morning, Hare," said Hedgehog politely in his funny clipped voice, "and you're quite right. I am out for a walk. I go for a walk every day and I enjoy it very much." Hare burst into laughter again.
"Walk? Walk, Hedgehog?" Hare said. "You really can't call that a walk. A waddle, perhaps, or even a crawl, not a walk. Only real animals walk and run, like horses and dogs, even rabbits, I suppose, but best of all, of course, hares. We are the fastest of them all."
Such boastful language made Hedgehog very angry indeed, and he decided he would teach Hare a lesson. By this time a great many animals had gathered to listen to the conversation, and they were astonished to hear Hedgehog say, "I don't think you're right, Hare. I don't think you're fastest of us all. In fact, I don't think you can run as fast as I can." Hare couldn't believe his ears, nor could the other animals, for they all know very well just how fast hares run and how slow hedgehogs walk. They were even more surprised when Hedgehog added, "Just to settle the matter, we'll have a race, and I'll wager that I can win." By this time Hare was laughing so much he could hardly speak.
You must be mad, Hedgehog. How can the slowest animal win a race against the fastest? Of course I'll accept your wager. What do you wager?"
Before Hedgehog could answer, all his friends tried to stop him talking any more, because they knew he couldn't win a race against Hare. But Hedgehog went on, "The loser gives a party for all the animals who live in and around the field and the wood. Let's shake paws on it." Hare took Hedgehog's paw and shook it hard.
"I'd give a party for all the animals in the world if I lost this race. Let's have the race now."
"No, not now," replied Hedgehog. "You're probably tired after all the running you've been doing today, and it wouldn't be fair."
"I'm not tired, Hedgehog," said Hare. "Let's race now and get it over with."
"No, Hare," said Hedgehog firmly. "Tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. You can imagine what excitement there was amongst all the animals, not only because they liked races, even though they felt quite sure who was going to win the race, but because there was going to be a big party, and that meant lots to eat and drink with singing, dancing and games, and above all, laughing. Meanwhile, Hedgehog hurried home to Mrs. Hedgehog and told her exactly what had happened with Hare and what he'd wagered with him. "You must be quite stupid, Henry Hedgehog. How on earth can you run faster than Harry Hare?" said Hilda Hedgehog. "I said that I thought I could, and perhaps I can't. My wager with Harry Hare is that I can win the race." "You're talking in riddles, Henry Hedgehog. How can you win the race if you can't run faster than Hare?" said Hilda Hedgehog. "If you sit down, I'll tell you. And what is more, it isn't me who's going to win the race, but you, Hilda Hedgehog." "Me?" cried out Mrs. Hedgehog. "Me? I can't even meander as fast as you, Henry Hedgehog, and you're a slow mover, even for a hedgehog." "Will you please keep quiet and listen to me?" went on Hedgehog. "As you know, one of the good things about us hedgehogs is that we all look exactly alike. The only difference between us is size, some large, some medium, some small. But you and I, Hilda Hedgehog, are exactly the same size." "Large," said Mrs. Hedgehog. "Quite right," nodded Henry Hedgehog, "and so nobody can tell the difference between the two of us. We're going to run this race down the furrows in the big meadow. Hare in one furrow, me in another. I will be at the start with Hare, but you, Hilda Hedgehog, will be in the furrow at the finishing end, and you'll pop up just before Hare arrives. Harry Hare will be astonished to find I've arrived at the finishing post before him, though it won't really be me, it will be you. Now, what do you think of that?" "Very clever, Henry Hedgehog," replied Mrs. Hedgehog, "but it's cheating a bit, isn't it?" "We must teach Harry Hare a lesson," said Hedgehog. "He must learn not to boast. And in any case, he's very rich, and it's his turn to give a party." The next morning arrived, and all the animals were up early. Decorations were put up, and everyone was in merry mood as the time for the race approached. Hilda Hedgehog made her way to the finishing post and hid in the furrow. Harry Hare was already at the starting post, dressed in bright red running shorts and a white vest. Then Henry Hedgehog, yawning loudly, meandered up lazily to join him. "Oh, I really feel too tired to race," said Henry Hedgehog, "but never mind, I am sure I can still win." Charlie the Cockerel was chosen to be the starter, and he fluttered onto a branch above the starting line. "Listen to me," he called out. "Henry Hedgehog and Harry Hare, I'm going to give you your starting instructions. When I say cock-caw, that means are you ready? When I say doodle, that means steady. And when I say do, that means go. Do you understand?" They said they did understand, and all the animals quietened down in anticipation of the excitement ahead. Then Charlie the Cockerel puffed his feathers out, and looking very important, called out, "Cock-caw, doodle, do!" Harry Hare disappeared like a flash of lightning, while Henry Hedgehog dodged behind a big stone and made himself look as small as possible. When Harry Hare arrived at the other end of the field, he couldn't believe his eyes, for there, waiting by the finishing post, was a hedgehog, whom Harry Hare thought was Henry. My, said the pretending Henry Hedgehog, "you've taken a very long time." Harry Hare was furious, and said that he'd had a stone in his paw, and made all sorts of excuses, and immediately challenged Hedgehog to another race. "As many races as you like," was the reply, and so it was. They had race after race. Each time Hare went faster and faster, yet each time it seemed that Hedgehog was at the finishing post before him. After several races, Harry Hare was quite exhausted and lay on the ground puffing and panting. The animals cheered, and Henry Hedgehog was declared the winner. A victory wreath was placed round his neck, and then Harry Hare was carried home to his burrow and put to bed. Henry and Hilda Hedgehog met back at their home and chuckled over the lesson they had taught Harry Hare. The grand party was arranged for the next day so that Hare would have time to recover and prepare for the festivities. It was to be a splendid occasion, and when Henry Hedgehog arrived, the animals clapped and cheered. And then, when Harry Hare appeared, still weary and looking very sorry for himself, Henry Hedgehog called out, 3 cheers for Hare, and the countryside echoed to 3 of the loudest cheers that had ever been heard. Hare had never been treated so kindly, and he was so pleased that he gave up boasting and became a very happy hare instead. In fact, instead of calling him Harry, many of the animals called him Happy Hare from then onwards.
The Story of the Sleeping Beauty. Very many years ago, there lived a young king and queen who ruled over a happy and prosperous country. They loved one another very much, but their one great sorrow was that it seemed that they weren't going to be blessed with a baby. Their subjects, too, longed to hear that a prince or princess was going to be born. But years passed, and no such announcement came. And then, one rainy November day, there was a great flurry in the palace courtyard as horses were led from the stables and hurriedly saddled. Messengers assembled, mounted their steeds, and clattered over the drawbridge. Within hours, the whole kingdom had heard the glad tidings from their young king and queen. A royal baby was expected in the spring. Despite the fact that the birth was several months away, the citizens behaved as if the baby had already arrived. There was singing and dancing in the streets, fireworks in the parks, and, of course, services of thanksgiving in all the churches. The months soon passed, and gradually the days became longer and warmer. Buds filled out, and bulbs pushed their way through the earth. And then, on an April day, when the first blossom appeared on the trees, a little princess, a baby girl, was born to the king and queen. She was beautiful and fair. Bells were pealed throughout the land to welcome her into the world. Never had there been such excitement, and grand preparations started for the royal christening in May. Now, thereabouts in those days were 13 fairies, each one of whom were guardians to any royal prince or princess, and it was the custom that they be invited to a royal christening to participate in the festival and bestow gifts upon the little child. Accordingly, the king ordered that invitations be dispatched to the fairies immediately, bidding them to attend the royal christening. It so happened that one of the fairies had a particularly disagreeable nature and had moved to some far land without telling anyone where she'd gone to. When the king's chancellor realized he couldn't send the 13th fairy an invitation, he decided not to tell the king, particularly because, well, she always upset the other guests, and it would therefore be of no great importance if she wasn't present. On the night before the christening, there was a great banquet at the palace, and places of honor were laid at the table for the 12 fairies. The table glittered with gold cutlery and plate, and the tall candles lit the banqueting hall in all its color and splendor. The guests assembled, and then the bugles sounded to announce the arrival of the 12 fairies bearing their gifts for the baby princess. One by one they approached the king and queen, announcing the gifts they bestowed. The first, beauty. The second, happiness. The third, gentleness. The fourth, humility. The fifth, courage. The sixth, humor. The seventh, generosity. The eighth, wisdom. The ninth, good health. The 10th, prosperity. The 11th, peace. And suddenly there was a horrible, cackling laugh, and into the hall burst the 13th fairy, and stood before the king and queen.
"And why, your majesties, was I not asked?"
she shrieked. The king was about to say he didn't understand, when his chancellor hurried forward to explain what had happened. The king assured the 13th fairy that had they known where she lived, she would, of course, have received an invitation. The fairy wouldn't listen, and spreading her arms wide, called out to the assembled company,
I will tell you all what my gift to your baby princess will be. Before she's grown out of childhood, she will prick her finger on the needle of a spinning wheel and will die.
The guests were horrified, and the king jumped to his feet, and before he had time to plead with the wicked fairy, she vanished. The hall was filled with cries of consternation, but suddenly a small, clear voice pierced the hubbub of noise.
Your Majesties, I am the 12th fairy, and had not bestowed my gift, the gift of long life. I have not the power to take away the wicked fairy's gift, nor she mine. So when the princess pricks her finger, she will not die, but will fall into a deep and peaceful sleep, as will you, your Majesties, and all your subjects, for 100 years.
Though there was great relief that the princess wouldn't die, there was still dismay at the thought that the young child would one day fall asleep for 100 years. For 100 years is a very long time indeed, far longer than any of us is likely to live. Accordingly, the king issued an edict that all spinning wheels in the kingdom were to be destroyed, and no more were to be manufactured. The citizens readily agreed to carry out this order, since none of them wanted harm to come to their princess. The years passed, and the princess grew into a lovely young girl, and the gifts which the first 11 fairies had bestowed upon the princess were very plain to see. She was much loved by everyone, for she was so kind and happy a person. And then one day, when she was nearly 16, she was playing with some friends in the grounds of the castle, and they were exploring an old stable and coach house. The princess found a winding stone staircase, which led up to a little turret room. She ran up the steps and entered the room. In the corner by the window, she could see a strange wooden wheel on a little platform with a pedal. It was, of course, a spinning wheel, but she'd never seen one before because they'd all been destroyed when she was a tiny baby. But someone had forgotten this spinning wheel, and the wicked fairy had made sure that the princess would find it. She called out to her friends to come and see what she'd found, and ran to the little stool by the spinning wheel. She sat down and started examining the machine, but she didn't notice the needle. She discovered how to turn the wheel, and had barely moved it when the needle pierced her little finger. She laughed and stood up, but almost at once started to feel drowsy. She noticed some straw on the other side of the room and lay down upon it. No sooner had her head touched the straw than she fell into a deep, deep sleep. At the same time, every person and every animal in the kingdom settled into a comfortable position and fell asleep. The 100 years had started, and the kingdom slumbered. No one dared enter the kingdom from another country, for the wicked fairy had been very angry indeed when she heard that the 12th fairy had changed her wish and set about spreading stories about the dangers of entering the kingdom of no life. And so the years rolled by, and the grasses, bushes, and trees continued to grow. Ivy grew round the palace, and the little turret in which the princess slumbered could scarcely be seen through all the greenery. Exactly 100 years after the princess had pricked her finger with the needle, a handsome young prince from distant lands was visiting a neighboring country. One day he was out hunting, and he was galloping towards the frontier of the sleeping kingdom. His colleague called out, "Sire, sire, you must not go there." "Why not?" called back the prince. "Because it is dangerous, sire. There is no life. They say it is bewitched." The prince only laughed and shouted, "Nonsense," and rode across the frontier, disappearing into the trees. His companions turned back because they were afraid. The prince drew his sword to cut a path for his horse through the thick undergrowth. Suddenly he halted, for there, lying on his back with his hands behind his head, and stretched out upon a thick bed of moss, lay a strangely dressed man. He had an axe beside him, and the prince assumed that he must be a forester. The prince sprang from his horse, fearing that the man was dead. He knelt beside him, and was relieved to hear the man breathing. Hoping to ask him the way to the nearest town, he shook the man to wake him. But the man slept on, and the prince remounted and journeyed on. Soon he passed through a village where there were children asleep on a haystack, and an old lady slumbering in a rocking chair. A farm labourer leant peacefully on his fork, and even the animals were asleep. The prince shouted out, but no one stirred, and he remembered what his companion had said about this strange country. For many hours the prince travelled on until he saw some tall golden gates overgrown with creeper, and in front of them stood 2 tall soldiers asleep, standing at attention. The prince realized that this must be the royal palace, so he dismounted, and again using his sword, he cut away the roots and branches entwined around the gates. He tied his horse to one of the gates, and then eased the other gate open, just enough to enter the palace grounds. He could see one of the palace towers above the forest of trees, and he started cutting his way towards it. Suddenly, his sword struck something hard, and he realized there was a small building within the bushes. He felt a strange kind of excitement as he tore at the ivy roots, and presently he came to a door which was partly open. He pushed it further open and again called out, but there was no reply. He saw some twisting stone steps, and he ran towards them and climbed them 2 at a time. He found himself in a small, dark turret, and he could just see a window which was almost entirely blocked with thick foliage. He pulled it away with his hands, and the sun and fresh air poured into the room. He turned to look around the room, and his heart almost stopped beating. For there, lying peacefully on a bed of straw, lay the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen in his life. He walked quietly over to her and knelt beside her. He could hear her breathing, and as he lifted her small, warm hand, he whispered, "The Sleeping Beauty." He gazed at her lovingly for a few seconds, and then, bending down, kissed her gently on the lips. At once the princess stirred, and her eyes opened. When she saw the handsome prince kneeling over her, she smiled with happiness. She jumped up, took the prince's hand in her own, and said, "Follow me." Suddenly the prince heard young voices shouting and laughing as they came out of the stable. He saw people and animals moving about, already clearing away the growth of 100 years. The wicked fairy's spell had ended. The princess took the prince to the palace, where the king and queen explained to the bewildered prince just what had happened. The prince and princess, my Sleeping Beauty, as the prince always called her thereafter, fell deeply in love with one another, and within 2 years were married at a splendid wedding in the great cathedral. All the fairies, including the 13th fairy, were invited to the wedding, and the 12th fairy was maid of honor. But the wicked fairy stayed away, for though she knew she'd been forgiven, she was ashamed to enter so happy a kingdom. After a few years, the prince became king in his own country, and so the Sleeping Beauty became queen, and there never was, nor ever will be, so beautiful and gracious a queen.